So my job is to remind all of you why you avoided biology in high school and in college. So I can save some time by identifying the problem that you've all been hearing about. Institutional care is common. There are many kids living in institutions that that could have been worse. Okay, this has not come out of my time. So, this is an old problem, and yet this is from the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1915. The best conditions for the infant thus requires a home and a mother. The further we get away from these vital necessities of beginning life, the greater will be our failure to get adequate results in trying to help the needy infant. Strange to say, these important conditions have often been overlooked or at least not sufficiently emphasized by those who are working in the field. That's 100 years ago this was stated. So, this is an old problem for which we need new solutions. So let's begin briefly by describing why institutional rearing might be bad for the brain. There's insensitive care that commonly occurs, regimented daily schedule, non-individualized care, isolation, no response to distress or unchecked aggression, lack of psychological investment by caregivers. This is probably perhaps the biggest one, rotating shifts and a high ratio of children to caregivers. We know from many decades of research now, and we'll go into more detail later on, that children reared in institutions are at a very high risk for a variety of social and behavioral problems, including disturbances of social relatedness and attachment, externalizing behavior problems, inattention hyperactivity, deficits in IQ and executive functions, a syndrome that mimics autism, growth stunting, and collectively we think that these developmental problems are believed to result from the deprivation inherent in institutional care. So the question is, why are these early years so important? So I want to now briefly talk about the role of experience in brain development. We know that genes play an essential role in the building blocks of brain development. However, because many aspects of an individual's world are not predictable, in other words, when we're born, we don't know what world we're going to be born into, the circuitry of the brain relies on experience to customize the connections to serve the needs of the individual. Experience shapes these neural connections. However, there's also this notion of critical periods. Early experience exerts a particularly strong influence in shaping the functional properties of the immature brain. Many neural connections pass through a period of development when the capacity for experience-driven modification is greater than it is in adulthood. Any of you who've tried to learn a language or play a sport as an adult or even a teenager realize how much more difficult that is than if you did this when you were younger. And we refer to these phases as critical periods or sensitive periods. So I'm just going to show this very brief movie, which is usually a 6-hour lecture that I give on brain development.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later.
What's the time? That says, please talk for 20 more minutes. What I'm going to do is just lay out the hypotheses underlying a study that we'll talk a little bit more about in the breakout section, which probably underpins most of what we know about why institutional rearing can affect the developing brain. That the deficits and developmental delays that result from institutional rearing have their origins in compromised brain development. For the brain to wire correctly, it needs input, and the lack of input leads to the underspecification of circuits and the miswiring of circuits. That's another way to get someone off the stage. Right. Normative input is lacking among children living in institutions, so we should expect errors in brain development. Finally, some domains of function are more experience-dependent than others, and for those that are experience-dependent, the timing of experience will vary by domain: cognition, attachment, language, and so on. So the efficacy, in our case of foster care, but really of any intervention, will vary by domain, by the age of placement, and by the duration of time. So I'm going to stop there, and we can talk more about this later. And Kate, want me to hook this up for you? Thank you. Thank you.
I'm your last speaker. You've made it almost all the way through. I also, like the other speakers said, I'm honored to be here today. This is wonderful. I'm so glad to be with all the fantastic researchers and have us together in this room, and all of you who are doing this important work. And here we go. So I've also been very honored over the past more than a decade now to work with incredible researchers and interviewers from around the globe, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. And we've been conducting a number of studies that look at the care of children who have been orphaned or separated from their parents. And one of the studies that I'm going to talk about here today, a little bit, some of the findings, is from the Positive Outcomes for Orphans study, where we've been following over 3,000 children. It's the only study of its kind that is multi-country. And we have been in Cambodia and Ethiopia and Tanzania and in Kenya, India. And we've been following children who are ages 6 and up, and we're now in year 7 of collecting data. A goal of this study when we started was to look at what is happening with kids out there right now in the southern countries, in low-income countries, and what are the caregiving characteristics that result in kids having better outcomes. That's the title of the study. And at the time, we really wanted to look at characteristics that transcend, that you can find across different care structures. And so when we started our study, we decided that we were going to look at kids who are in all sorts of different kinds of situations that are out there in the places where we were. And so that included residential care or institutions. And so half of our participants we decided to draw from institutions. Now, what is an institution? We came into a couple of definitional problems when we started the study. What is an orphan is also one of them, depending on who you, anyway. So what is an institution? We call them many different things. It can be a youth village, it can be a group home, it can be a children's home, it can be a residential facility, it could be a residential education facility here in the US. I'm going to use the term institution because that's what's used in our policy documents that are coming out around the world. But there isn't a common definition that's used. And then one of the questions is, okay, well, what does it look like? We have different names, and are there different characteristics to the institutions or group homes also? So do they all look like this? Do they harken back to early US or the images that we have of places in Eastern Europe? And what we found is that they look really different. And in the places where we were studying, it actually took us about 6 months in each of the sites to find all of the different group homes that were there. The easily identified ones were the ones that were government run, that were foreign funded. As we dug in, for example, in Moshi, Tanzania, we know we originally had 2-3 places on the list. By the end of the 6 months, we had over 30. Most of the places were small group homes that were run by people. In the end, we found that half of the caregivers were people who actually lived there full time. They weren't paid. It was like their family setting in a way. They would get money to go to the store or do these different things, but they weren't kind of the salaried employees. So So this was very interesting and different and not what we expected when we started the study. And so what were we looking at? Well, we were looking at cognition or learning ability. We're looking at behavior and emotional difficulties over time. And again, we're following these over 3,000 kids over time. We're looking at their health status. And now as they're getting older, we're looking at staying in school. We're looking at civic engagement, if they feel like they belong in their communities or not, and what they're doing there. We're looking at high-risk sexual behaviors, substance abuse behaviors, marital formation, all of that. So we can really look at the continuum of what's happening with the kids. When we end this study, the oldest kids will be in their early 20s. So when we looked at emotional difficulties just as one of the outcomes, I'm going to show you a number of them. We have baseline, that was the first year when we started the study, and we have the 3-year follow-up that we're showing here. We had kids who were living in, we're calling institutions, and kids who are living in the community. And you can see, I'm not putting the scales up here because it's not important, but you can see there's a variation. You've got a good variety of outcomes. We say good from a research perspective, not from not from perhaps the community perspective. You have kids who have great difficulties who are living in the community, who are bedwetting, who are fearful, who are acting out, and you have similarly kids who have a lot of problems who are living in institutions. Similarly, you have kids who are doing really well in institutions, and you have kids who are not doing well in institutions. So here you go again, baseline, this is learning ability, you've got institution community, 3-year follow-up, and again, those graphs really overlap. So if you said, okay, we're going to shut down right now without building up the community and doing all the good things that we need to do with families, if you take kids who, half of those kids who are doing well in their group home setting and put them out into the community, you may result in, there may be poorer outcomes. These are some of the other outcomes that we looked at, body mass index and health and difficulty score as rated by the caregiver. Now, importantly, we also, some of the things that's talked about a lot, at least in the where I walk, is the fear of sexual and physical abuse that happens in group homes. And there have been studies that have looked, but looking just at the group homes, this slide shows, you can't really see it very well, but on the bottom is age 10, 11, 12, up to age 15. And you've got the prevalence of sexual and severe physical abuse that's happening. And what you can see here is there's very little difference, again, between institutions and communities. Does abuse happen in institutions? Yes, it does. It does. Terrible things happen there. There are also places where terrible things don't happen. And likewise, as has been talked about today by some of the other presenters, the communities where kids are living, for many of them, are quite dangerous places. And when we look at some of the kids who are in institutions, when you look at people talk about there being a biological parent somewhere, that 90% of the kids, one study has shown, 90% of the kids who have a biological parent were being maltreated in their home. So we need to build up those homes. So again, when we think about the cost, and that institutions, group homes, cost more than family settings, we also need to think about how we need to spend more, as we are moving to do, to build up families so that they're able to take care of kids, and that there's probably going to be a group of kids. These are all group homes, including that last picture. So, you can have care within the group homes that is one-on-one, where there's time and there's kids facing each other. Again, our kids in our study were 6 and older. So while we have the movement towards reintegration that we've been talking about, we need to be really careful that we don't end up moving kids while trying to make things better for them and assuming that the family, reintegrating with the family, is the best thing to do because they're the biological family, and without providing the supports. We want to make sure we don't make things worse for them. And we are seeing in places like Cambodia, for a number of kids, that they are ending up going into sex work. They're reintegrated with the family was abusive, the family didn't want them, they end up going into sex work, they end up going to the Thai border. And so we need to be careful. I'm just saying we need to be careful in what we're doing. And we need to let the children really speak for themselves and And if we listen to their voices and integrate what they need, as was talked about by Dr. Breitstein this morning, we need a menu of options for them. And we're going to need that menu for a while. So we need to build up the families. We need to make it so that kids aren't ending up in group homes to begin with, in institutions to begin with. We need to work with foster care, if we can develop those systems, adoption, we need to work with, and there's a place for group homes for a while to come. And I'm about done here before I get off the stage. As we create policies, we need to take the science that you're learning here and appropriately use it. So rather than a rule of thumb for every 3 months the child stays in an institution, he loses a month of development, let's look at infants and socially deprived environments. Let's look at the environment they're in, and those are bad places that we need to get rid of. So for policy implications, I really don't see for a while that one size fits all. And we need to be careful when there are documents like the US Action Plan on Children in Adversity that say we need to get kids, countries will be accountable by the number of kids they get out of institutions. We really need to be accountable for the well-being of those children and making sure they're in the right place that's best for them. Thank you.
Yeah. Stay, Dr. Whetten, stay up. Dr. Whetten, just stay up here. Dr. Nelson, you want to come on up? And
I'm not answering questions.
You're not answering questions? No, you can't answer questions.
I went over time, right?
No, you're good. Here, I'm going to turn this over so you both have, one of you could do this.
Okay.
And then we'll, anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? Oh, look, so many. And if when they ask the question, if you
repeat it,
it'd be great.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions. One is if there are studies, if there could be studies that have been done to compare children living in institutions and children that are living in foster homes. The reason why I ask is that I grew up as an orphan. I was in homes, but that did not stop people, the kids that I was living with, calling me names, telling me that I came to eat their food, and all kind of isolation and discrimination. That is one question. 2, I'm wondering if the studies you have done have any methodological limitations as to why they should not be compared, or we should not believe in them, or we should take them also.
All right, well, I can talk a little bit. The study that we've done doesn't look at foster care. Foster care is a very specific kind of definition, but we have looked at the kids who are living in families. And when we looked at stigma that those children were facing, so the orphaned and separated children, and we found that stigma to be very high. I believe you have also, Paula. And in fact, and you look at stigma and it's related to education and it's related to the age of the caregiver and things like that. And so we also did find that there was less in the group homes than in family settings, which is not to say that kids, we move all kids into group homes, but that there are factors, there's education that's needed. So that's part of what's needed in the communities is education, working with the families, and I actually can talk more about this when we have the breakout, if you come to that session about what we're seeing in terms of needing to wrap care around the families and not just the child. And in terms of limitations, a limitation of ours is that it's a longitudinal, it's a cohort study, which is great. We randomly selected the kids, that's great. But we're not randomizing the kids into the different care settings. And so that's always going to be something that's, and that Dr. Nelson and his group has done very well. And we also are looking at different populations in different settings.
So in terms of your first question, our critical comparison were kids in institutions versus kids in foster care. But we've now recently done a secondary comparison. So a subset of our kids that began in institutional care were later placed in government foster care. And if we do a head-to-head comparison between our foster care and government, the differences are quite dramatic. Needless to say, the kids in government foster care don't do that well. And the reason is that it's government foster care, no different than foster care anywhere else in the world where they cut corners. So That's one way to address the issue of foster care versus institutional care. Remember, care exists on a continuum, so, and that was an important point we heard in the last presentation, from truly awful neglect all the way up to the other end of the spectrum. Where you plop down institution versus foster care versus family almost is arbitrary in some ways. It depends on the quality of care. In terms of flaws, we don't have enough time to spend on the flaws in our study, but I'll tell you the one that is impossible to work around. We did random assignment out of an institution into families, but we didn't do random assignment into an institution for the obvious reasons that you can't do that. So there always is the possibility that kids who land in institutions are somehow different than the kids who don't land in institutions, and that's a point of consideration.
Okay, over here. Yes.
Well, you said there's a lot of variety in institutions, but then you talked about caregiving characteristics to kind of step out of, you know, an institution versus other. Are there certain caregiving characteristics that were correlated with better outcomes?
Yeah, so we have over 80 group homes in our study, and we're still teasing apart the characteristics. But what I can say is that the term that's been used here today, the family-like care, seems to be what results in the best outcomes for kids. So, you know, having a caregiver who's long-term, the women who live there, it's not necessarily, and what's I think hard for perhaps some of the NGOs here, it seems that the homes that are built up out of the community, that are really of the community and not by the government, and where the kids go to school at the local school, so they're not receiving foreign funding, they're not receiving a lot of funding, that those kids seem to be doing pretty well. And it does seem, from what we see, that the government, I can say the government-run institutions in general, the kids seem to be amongst the worst off. And we can go back to, you know, the shift care, all the things that have been talked about today where those things happen. They don't happen in the smaller places, at least as much.
One way to approach that is you could toss out the window, if it's an institution or a family, and just make a continuum of quality of care, and that could account for a lot of the findings.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yes. See, we agree on lots of things.
And we're doing the session together, so.
Well, my question is, if you've done some studies in cultures where an extended family plays a role in adopting or taking care of the children instead of children being put in a foster care, where an extended family, in some village, the people just basically, it's not legally done, it's culturally done. Have you done some studies how that affect the children or how those children are doing?
We can't tease that apart. So the kids in the extended family in our study would be considered children who are in the families. We can't tease apart kind of the extended family, but I can say that for some of the large, where you've got a grandmother or a couple of adults caring for many children, that can be a difficult situation for the kids. But this could be a place where there could be an intervention to provide that large family unit with access to more resources, appropriate resources, income generating activity, different things to ameliorate kind of the poverty that often comes along with that.
The only thing I'd have to say is that we've now, the first question touched on foster care, your question touches on extended family care. And I think that this was raised in Dr. Whetten's comments as well. That is, there's a range of environments in which kids who have experienced early adversity can be placed. I think we need to take a close look at those, but one of the key variables will be the age at which the child is placed in those environments, as much as what that environment looks like. And the second will be where they're coming from. So we have a background of some type of adversity. How they do in one environment versus another will depend on how awful that background is, and how old they were when they got removed from that. So as we think about policy recommendations, we need to keep those two variables in mind.
In talking about the spectrum of the quality of care, will you guys in your breakout session talk a little bit about what those actual parameters are that define quality of care?
Not specifically. We didn't talk generally. We're still looking at it. We're still trying to figure it out.
We've measured caregiving quality using something called the observational record of the caregiving environment. We use it as a variable in a lot of our analyses. In fact, Dana's used it in just accounting for a chunk of the changes in growth. But we haven't broken it down to figure out precisely what's going on within that envelope that leads to better outcomes versus worse outcomes, which is, I think, really what you're asking. Because if you were to bring this to scale in a new intervention, you'd want to know exactly what it is that accounts for the bulk of the variance.
So is there any current research going on in terms of, like, what is it that makes good quality care, since we're going to drop, you know, maybe the labels of institution versus foster versus kinship home? You know, what is it? Is it the child-giver ratio? Is it?
You know, what I would do here, I'm a little out of my element here, but what I'll refer you to is the NICHD daycare study, which has spent 20 years trying to unpack all that. So in this study, of course, what they've tried to look at is, well, it began with the premise of what are the effects of putting kids in daycare, which of course is code for what are the effects of women going back to work, right? But the bottom line is that they spent an enormous amount of energy trying to figure out what makes a good daycare. And it probably is no different than what we're talking about here. And you listed a few of the things just a minute ago. The ratio of kids to caregivers, how educated they are, how well paid they are, how invested they are, how long they stay in their job. You know, all of those things are probably factors that apply to this situation as well.
And I'll say, you know, we continue to try and tease this out, but there are others in the room who are also working on different interventions, and I give a plug for doing really good evaluations that we need, kind of what we call evidence-based interventions with families, as we talked about, with income-generating activities, with and for group home care also. So if you're engaged in interventions, doing really good evaluations so that we can try to really start accumulating that evidence is important. And I know it's an ad, we want to give as many dollars as possible to the kids to help them, but doing the evidence-based, doing the evaluations allows us to do better work in the future, and it'll help the kids in the future to be able to do that.